Chapter 1. Emma is interested in Harriet. Emma Woodhouse had everything. She was beautiful, clever, and rich. And she lived very comfortably with her father in a fine house called Hartfield in the village of Highbury. Emma's life as a young child became unhappy when her mother died, so Mr. Woodhouse found a woman called Miss Taylor to teach Emma and her sister Isabella. Later, when Emma's sister married Mr. John Knightley and went to live in London, Miss Taylor soon became more of a friend than a governess to Emma. After Miss Taylor married and moved away, Emma missed her friend and her good conversation greatly. Emma and her father knew many people in Highbury, but she had no good friends of her own age. She spent many evenings alone with her father, and they were long and often boring. One evening after supper, an old friend of the family walked into the room. Mr. George Knightley was a man of 37 or 38 years who lived near Highbury and often visited Emma and her father. His brother John was married to Emma's sister Isabella.
"Shall I tell you about Miss Taylor's wedding, Mr. Knightley?"
said Emma, trying to sound happy.
"Poor Emma,"
said her father.
"She misses Miss Taylor very much."
"Of course Emma misses her friend,"
said Mr. Knightley.
"but I'm sure she is happy that Miss Taylor has married."
"Yes, I am,"
said Emma, smiling.
"And don't forget that they married because of me. I decided it 4 years ago, when you all said that Mr. Weston didn't want to marry again."
"Oh dear,"
said Mr. Woodhouse.
"Please don't match-make any more, Emma. Things always happen as you say they will."
"But, Papa, I love matchmaking," replied Emma, laughing.
Mr. Weston married Miss Taylor because he loves her and she loves him, not because he met her through you,"
said Mr. Knightley, shaking his head.
"But, Mr. Knightley,"
she said,
"I knew how they felt before they knew it themselves. That is the secret of a good matchmaker."
Emma sometimes asked a group of her father's friends to spend the evening at Hartfield. On one of these evenings, Emma felt very excited. A young woman of 17 was coming to the party. She had no friends or family, but she was very beautiful. Her name was Harriet Smith. Emma was interested in Harriet, and they spent the evening talking. Harriet was not very clever, but she was friendly, kind, and had beautiful blue eyes. When Harriet and her father's friends left, Emma made a plan. She wanted to teach Harriet, to be her friend, and to introduce her to the important people in Highbury. Emma started to spend a lot of time with Harriet, and she soon knew all about her. Harriet told her about her friends, the Martins. She often stayed with them on their farm, and she liked Mr. Robert Martin very much. One day, while the young women were out walking, they met Mr. Martin. Emma saw at once that Harriet liked him a lot, and she was very unhappy about it. A farmer was not the right husband for beautiful Harriet. Emma decided to be Harriet's matchmaker. Emma soon thought of the right person for Harriet. It was Mr. Elton, a handsome young clergyman with a comfortable home who needed a wife. Emma started work at once. She spoke to Harriet about Mr. Elton and to Mr. Elton about Harriet, and planned lots of ways for them to meet. Mr. Elton started to visit Hartfield often, and Emma was sure that her plan was working well.
I see that you have taught Miss Smith a lot and have helped her to become a much better person,
Mr. Elton told Emma one day.
Oh, no,
said Emma, smiling.
Harriet has always been kind and beautiful. I have done very little.
You are always right, Emma,
replied Mr. Elton warmly. Emma was sure that he spoke with love in his eyes, and at once she thought of a new plan.
Would you like me to paint your picture, Harriet?
Emma asked one day in front of Mr. Elton. Harriet was unsure, but Mr. Elton thought that it was a wonderful plan. Emma began at once. She was a good painter, and soon finished a fine picture.
Do you think that it is a nice picture, Mr. Elton?
asked Emma, smiling.
It is the best picture I have ever seen. It is quite beautiful. You are a very clever painter, Emma,
said Mr. Elton.
I shall take it to London for a frame at once.
He is very handsome and just right for Harriet,
Emma thought to herself.
but I find him boring.
While Mr. Elton was in London, Harriet arrived at Hartfield one morning with a big surprise.
Emma, you will never believe it.
She said excitedly.
Mr. Martin has asked me to marry him.
Emma was not happy when she saw that Harriet wanted to say yes to Mr. Martin.
You cannot marry him, Harriet,
she said coldly.
He is only a farmer. If you marry him, we could not be friends. I could not visit a farmer's wife.
Poor Harriet! She did what Emma told her and wrote to Mr. Martin to say no, but she was very unhappy. Another person was also unhappy when he heard the news. Mr. Knightley knew Mr. Martin well and liked him a lot. He was very angry when Emma told him Harriet's answer.
Did you tell Harriet not to marry him, Emma?
He asked.
Yes, I did,
replied Emma, smiling sweetly.
But Mr. Martin is a kind, intelligent man. He has a fine home and farm, and Harriet was lucky that he liked her. Harriet has no family, and she couldn't find a better husband. You have been no friend to Harriet, Emma,
he said crossly. Emma did not like Mr. Knightley to be angry with her, but she was sure that she was right.
You are wrong, Mr. Knightley,
she said.
Harriet can marry someone much better than Mr. Martin.
Mr. Knightley got up quickly and walked to the door.
Good morning to you,
he said coldly, and left. Chapter 2. Emma feels uncomfortable. When Mr. Elton came back from London with the picture in its frame, he put it in the sitting room at Hartfield and looked at it lovingly. Emma watched him and thought of a new plan. She and Harriet were making a book of love poems, so she asked Mr. Elton to write something for it. He happily agreed, and when he finished, he gave his poem to Emma and left the room. It was called To Miss... Emma read the poem to herself quickly.
Oh, Harriet,
she said excitedly.
it is clear that he has written it for you and that he loves you. I'm sure that he will ask you to marry him soon. I'm so happy. I know that I was right to matchmake for you and Mr. Elton. Now you must read his poem.
At first, Harriet could not believe that Mr. Elton loved her, but Emma soon persuaded her that it was true. Harriet was very happy, and she even stopped thinking about Mr. Martin. The next day, she and Emma went for a walk past Mr. Elton's house.
Just think, Harriet. One day you will live there as Mrs. Elton, a clergyman's wife,
said Emma. Harriet smiled, and then she looked thoughtful.
But Emma, what about you? I can't understand why you don't want a husband too,
she said.
Harriet, I don't need a husband,
replied Emma with a confident smile. Emma's sister Isabella and her family came to stay at Hartfield for Christmas. During their visit, Mr. and Mrs. Weston invited them all to their house for dinner. Knowing that Mr. Elton was also a guest, Emma asked Mrs. Weston to invite Harriet too. But in the end, Harriet had a cold and could not go. While they were waiting to leave for the Westons' house, Isabella's husband, Mr. John Knightley, turned to Emma.
I have watched Mr. Elton, Emma, and he likes you very, very much,
he said, with a knowing look.
Do you like him too?
Emma laughed.
We are good friends, that's all. Surely you don't really think that he loves me?
She replied. At dinner, Mr. Elton came and sat next to Emma. He smiled a lot and was very attentive to her all evening. Emma remembered John Knightley's words, and she felt uncomfortable.
Mr. Elton hasn't spoken about Harriet once this evening,
thought Emma.
And he is spending all his time with me. If he loves Harriet, that isn't right.
While she was thinking, Mr. Weston spoke to her.
Emma, we have some news. We have had a letter from my son Frank, and he is coming to visit us,
he said excitedly.
That's wonderful, Mr. Weston,
said Emma, smiling. Emma thought that Frank Churchill sounded very interesting, and she wanted to meet him. Mr. Weston's first wife died when his son Frank was a young child, and the young man now lived with his rich aunt and uncle, Mr. and Mrs. Churchill. They had no children themselves, and Frank was like a son to them. He even changed his name to Churchill to please them. When it was time to go home, Emma said goodbye and waited for her carriage. To her surprise, Mr. Elton climbed into it with her. Before she could say anything, he took her hand, looked into her eyes, and told her that he loved her. Emma was so surprised that she did not know what to say.
But, Mr. Elton,
she cried.
You can't love me. You love Harriet.
Harriet?
Cried Mr. Elton.
What are you saying? I've never loved Harriet in my life.
And he thought to himself,
It's true that Harriet is beautiful, but she isn't rich. No, Emma, my dearest,
he went on.
It is you that I love, and I thought that you felt the same about me. Say that you will marry me,
he said, looking deeply into her eyes. Emma could not believe what was happening. This was not what she planned.
Mr. Elton, please stop this at once,
she cried angrily.
I will not marry you.
They both sat there, feeling angry, and neither Emma nor Mr. Elton spoke for the rest of the journey. The next day, Mr. Elton left hurriedly for the city of Bath, in the south-west of England. Emma was relieved that she did not have to see him for a while.
I know that Mr. Elton doesn't love me. He only wants to marry me for my money,
thought Emma. Then she remembered Harriet.
Oh dear, and I persuaded Harriet that Mr. Elton loved her. Now I will have to tell her.
Harriet cried a lot when she heard the news, but she did not blame Emma, and she did not blame Mr. Elton. Because Harriet was so nice about it all, Emma felt worse. Not long after this, Emma had more bad news. Frank Churchill couldn't come to Highbury until later in the year.
Oh dear, and I really wanted to meet him. He sounds so interesting,
she said to Mr. Knightley, who was visiting Hartfield.
Well, I'm sure that he could come if he really wanted to,
replied Mr. Knightley coldly.
I think that he is making an excuse.
Emma was surprised.
Mr. Knightley, why do you say that?
She asked.
It's clear that his father wants to see him now, not later,
replied Mr. Knightley crossly.
I think that he is a selfish young man.
Well, I don't,
replied Emma coldly.
and I'm sure that he will come to Highbury as soon as he can.
Mr. Knightley said nothing after that. Chapter 3. Emma doesn't like Jane. A few days later, while Emma and Harriet were out walking, they decided to visit Mrs. and Miss Bates. Mrs. Bates was a widow who lived in Highbury with her unmarried daughter. Miss Bates was a kind woman, but she was very talkative, and Emma thought she was silly and boring. She did not often visit her, but she wanted to introduce her to Harriet. When Miss Bates saw Emma and Harriet, she was very happy because she had some news to tell them.
Miss Woodhouse, can you believe what has happened? We have had a letter today from my niece, Jane Fairfax, who is living in Weymouth, a very nice town by the sea in the southwest of England. She is coming to stay with us, and we are very excited. You like Jane, don't you, Miss Woodhouse? She is a beautiful girl and so clever.
Yes, of course, Miss Bates. When is she coming?
Replied Emma, trying to sound interested.
Next week. She is coming for 3 months, and there is so much to do before she arrives.
Worried Miss Bates.
Then, after her time with us, Jane will look for a job as a governess,
said Mrs. Bates unhappily. Jane Fairfax was the same age as Emma, but they were not good friends. It was true that Jane was beautiful and clever. Everybody who knew her liked her, but Emma was a little jealous of Jane. She liked being the only beautiful and clever young woman in Highbury. Like Harriet, Jane Fairfax did not have any family or money, and without a rich husband, she needed to work. Emma did not like Jane, but she felt sorry for her. So when she saw her again, she tried to be friendly.
I believe you met Frank Churchill while you were in Weymouth, Jane?
Said Emma cheerfully.
Yes, I did,
replied Jane.
He is coming to visit Mr. and Mrs. Weston in Highbury soon,
said Emma, trying to smile.
Did you know?
Oh, really?
Replied Jane, looking uninterested.
I think that he sounds a very nice man. Did you like him?
Emma asked.
People say that he is a very nice man. I do not really know him myself,
replied Jane coldly. Jane was not very talkative, and Emma found the conversation difficult.
What is the matter with her?
She thought crossly.
Why is she being so cold and so unfriendly?
After that difficult afternoon, Emma did not really want to see Jane again very soon, but the next day Miss Bates and Jane came to visit her at Hartfield.
Emma, have you heard?
Said Miss Bates excitedly.
Mr. Elton is going to marry someone called Miss Hawkins from Bristol. I hear that she is very beautiful and very rich.
Emma could not believe this news. Could Mr. Elton have forgotten his words of love to her so soon?
But he has only been away for 4 weeks,
she said.
Yes, I know. He's a lucky man. And after the wedding, he will bring his bride back to Highbury. Isn't that good news?
Said Miss Bates, smiling happily. Emma did not think that it was very good news.
So, I was right about Mr. Elton?
Thought Emma to herself.
He was just looking for a rich wife, and that's why he asked me and not Harriet to marry him.
Mr. Elton came back to Highbury for a short visit before the wedding. Poor Harriet did not want to see him, but luckily she and Emma soon heard some news which stopped them thinking about Mr. Elton.
Emma, we have had a letter from Frank,
said Mr. Weston.
He is coming to Highbury tomorrow. I know that you would like to meet him, so I shall bring him to visit you.
Frank was tall, handsome and friendly, and Emma liked him at once. After tea, they agreed to meet the next day, and he left to go and visit Jane Fairfax and Miss Bates. The next day, Emma and Mrs. Weston showed Frank around Highbury. They stopped at the Crown Inn.
This is a good place for a party, Emma,
said Frank excitedly.
Why don't we have a ball here?
Oh, I love dancing. That's a wonderful idea,
cried Emma.
We can invite Harriet and Mr. Knightley, and Jane Fairfax, of course. Did you see her yesterday?
Yes, I did. And I met her aunt, Miss Bates,
replied Frank, laughing.
Did you often see Jane in Weymouth?
Asked Emma.
No, not often,
replied Frank.
And you? Are you good friends with her?
He asked.
I have known her since we were children, but we are not good friends. I think that Jane is too unfriendly to make friends easily,
replied Emma, and Frank quickly agreed with her. The next day, Emma talked about Frank to her friends.
He is very handsome, isn't he, Mrs. Weston?
She said.
Oh, yes,
replied Mrs. Weston.
Very handsome.
And so funny, too,
said Emma, smiling to herself. While they talked, Mr. Knightley sat reading his newspaper. He was tired of hearing everyone speak so warmly about Frank Churchill. Chapter 4. Is someone secretly in love? Some time later, Mr. and Mrs. Cole, who lived in Highbury, decided to have a dinner party. While they were waiting for all the guests to arrive, Frank Churchill came and sat next to Emma, and they talked. In the middle of their conversation, Emma overheard Mrs. Cole say something very interesting.
Did you know that Jane Fairfax has a piano now? It arrived today, and nobody knows who sent it,
said Mrs. Cole excitedly to her neighbour.
A piano,
thought Emma.
That's a very expensive present. I wonder who sent it.
Frank saw her looking thoughtful.
Maybe Jane Fairfax has an admirer,
he said playfully, and smiled at her.
Don't be silly,
said Emma, laughing.
I believe that Colonel Campbell sent it. He looked after her when she was a child, and is like a father to her. I'm sure that he sent it. I really don't think that Jane has an admirer.
She went on.
Or that she is looking for a husband. She is too unfriendly for that.
Yes, I'm sure that you're right,
agreed Frank immediately. Later that evening, Mrs. Weston came and sat next to Emma, and they talked about Jane Fairfax's piano.
You know, I think that Mr. George Knightley sent it,
said Mrs. Weston.
Mr. Knightley?
said Emma in surprise.
Yes, I think that Mr. Knightley is Jane's secret admirer,
replied Mrs. Weston, talking quietly.
You know that he loves listening to Jane play the piano. He always says that she has the best voice he has ever heard. And this evening, he sent his carriage for her and Miss Bates to travel in.
But that isn't anything unusual,
said Emma.
Mr. Knightley knows that they don't have a carriage, and he is always very kind to Miss Bates.
Well, I think that he sent it because he is secretly in love with Jane,
said Mrs. Weston, smiling in a playful way.
No, no, Mrs. Weston. I am sure that you are wrong. I know Mr. Knightley better than anyone,
said Emma confidently.
Jane and he are too different. Mr. Knightley is so warm and kind, and Jane Fairfax is so cold. No, it isn't possible. And don't forget, Mrs. Weston,
said Emma,
Mr. Knightley is like me. He doesn't want to marry.
But Emma could not persuade Mrs. Weston to believe her. Just then, everyone decided that it was time for some music. First, Emma played the piano, and she and Frank sang some songs together. Everyone agreed that they were a very handsome couple. After a few songs, Emma went back to her seat, and Jane sat at the piano and played and sang with Frank. She played the piano really beautifully, and she had a better voice than Emma, too. Emma looked at Mr. Knightley, who was watching Jane and smiling. It was clear that he loved listening to her. Everyone wanted Jane to sing song after song, but she was becoming tired. When Frank asked her to sing another song, Mr. Knightley glared at him and whispered to Miss Bates.
Miss Bates, please tell Jane to stop. She is too tired, and if she sings another song, she will be ill.
Emma was surprised.
He is being attentive to Jane. I wonder if Mrs. Weston is right,
she thought to herself. After the music, everyone wanted to dance. Emma loved dancing, and Frank was the first to ask her. As she danced, she looked around to see what Mr. Knightley and Jane were doing. She was happy to see that Jane was already dancing, and that Mr. Knightley was talking to Mrs. Cole. Frank was a fine dancer, and Emma soon forgot about Mr. Knightley possibly being Jane Fairfax's secret admirer. The next morning, Emma thought about the party and smiled. She was a little unhappy that she could not play the piano or sing as well as Jane, but she did not worry too much about it. Emma knew that she really needed to practice more, but she also knew that she was too lazy to do it. The next day, she met Harriet, and they went shopping in Highbury. In town, they saw Mrs. Weston and Frank.
We're going to visit Miss Bates and to listen to Jane playing her new piano. Please say that you will come too,
said Frank, smiling at Emma. Emma didn't really want to listen to Jane playing the piano again, but she decided that she wanted to spend some more time together with Frank. So they all went to Miss Bates's house together. Soon after they arrived, while they were listening to Jane playing, Miss Bates saw Mr. Knightley riding his horse past the house. She got up at once and went to the window.
Mr. Knightley?
She called.
Thank you for sending your carriage for us last night. Miss Woodhouse and Miss Smith are here. We are all listening to Jane playing the piano. Come in and have some tea with us.
Perhaps I will. But how is Jane? Is she well?
Mr. Knightley called back.
I hope that all her singing last night didn't hurt her voice.
No, she is quite well, thank you,
replied Miss Bates.
Will you come in for some tea now, Mr. Knightley? Mrs. Weston and Frank Churchill are here also.
Oh dear, I'm afraid I don't have time today, Miss Bates, but thank you. Perhaps some other time. Goodbye to you,
said Mr. Knightley, and he rode away. Chapter 5. The Eltons arrive in Highbury. Everyone enjoyed dancing at Mr. and Mrs. Cole's house, so Frank and Emma decided that they really had to begin organising the ball at the inn in the village. Mr. Weston happily agreed to pay the cost of using a large room at the Crown for the evening.
Emma, will you promise to have the first 2 dances at the Crown with me?
Frank asked her, hopefully.
Yes, of course,
replied Emma. She was pleased that Frank wanted to dance with her first. They were soon busy getting things ready. When Emma told Mr. Knightley of their plans for the ball, he was not very nice about it.
If Mr. Weston wants to pay a lot of money to the Crown, and you want to have the trouble of getting everything ready for weeks, and all for one evening of noisy dancing, eating and drinking, I won't stop you,
he said.
I will go to the ball, of course, to please you, and I will try not to fall asleep. But I won't enjoy myself, I'm sure.
Was Mr. Knightley uninterested in the ball because he didn't ever dance himself? Or was he perhaps angry because Emma didn't talk to him about her plans before she began to get things ready with Frank? She found it difficult to say.
But Mr. Knightley, what about watching everyone dancing? You would like that, surely?
Emma went on.
No, Emma,
answered Mr. Knightley.
I would not. I prefer staying at home to going out to balls.
Emma talked to Jane Fairfax about the plans for the ball, and she was very interested in what Jane had to say.
A ball? How wonderful! I love going to balls. I hope nothing will stop this one.
Emma thought back to Mrs. Weston's words about Mr. Knightley being in love with Jane.
Now I'm sure that story isn't true,
she said to herself.
Because Mr. Knightley really doesn't want to go to the ball, and Miss Fairfax really does want to.
But before they could have the ball at the Crown, Frank got some bad news. His mother was ill, and he had to go back to London to see her.
Oh, Frank, I'm so sorry,
said Emma unhappily.
We'll have to postpone the ball. We can't have it without you.
I'm sorry too, Emma,
said Frank.
But I'll come back as soon as I can. I'll miss you all very much.
Emma was very unhappy and thought about Frank all the time during the first few days that he was away.
I miss Frank a lot,
she thought, looking out of her bedroom window one night.
I wonder if I'm in love with him.
Then, one day, Emma heard some news which made her forget about Frank for a little while. Mr. Elton and his bride were travelling back to Highbury. Emma knew that Harriet was very worried about seeing Mr. Elton again, and she felt sorry for her.
Harriet, don't worry. Mr. Elton has a wife now, and I'm sure that he has forgotten about our silly mistake,
said Emma.
But Emma, I'm so embarrassed. I hope he doesn't speak to me. I won't know where to look,
replied poor Harriet. As soon as the Eltons arrived in Highbury, Mr. Elton took his wife to meet the people of the village. One day they came to Hartfield. Mrs. Elton was a loud woman who loved talking, mostly about herself and her family. She talked a lot about her brother's house and how it was very like Hartfield, but larger and better.
What a rude woman,
thought Emma angrily.
I really don't like her, and I'm sure that Frank won't like her either.
Mrs. Elton did not really like Emma. It was clear from the way she spoke that she knew all about Harriet foolishly believing Mr. Elton was in love with her, and about Emma's part in the story. But she was looking for a friend in Highbury, and so she tried to be nice. But Emma was quite cold with her. In the end, Mrs. Elton left Hartfield, feeling disappointed. She decided that she would try to become Jane Fairfax's friend instead of Emma Woodhouse's.
Poor Jane,
said Emma to her friends after this.
Now she will have to listen to Mrs. Elton all the time.
Jane is beautiful and clever, Emma. It is no surprise that Mrs. Elton wants her for a friend,
replied Mr. Knightley quietly.
We all know that you like Jane, Mr. Knightley. Perhaps more than you would like to say openly,
said Emma, turning to Mrs. Weston. Mr. Knightley looked embarrassed.
Emma, are you matchmaking again?
He asked.
Oh no, Mr. Knightley. I have learnt my lesson. I am just saying what some people are thinking,
she replied. Mr. Knightley looked thoughtful, and then he got up to leave.
Well, Emma, it is true that I admire Jane, but if you think that I am in love with her, then I am afraid you are wrong,
he said calmly, and left.
Well, Mrs. Weston, what do you say to that?
Asked Emma.
I say,
said Mrs. Weston, smiling,
that Mr. Knightley was embarrassed because you spoke the truth.
Emma really did not like Mrs. Elton, but she felt that she had to arrange a small dinner party for her. Harriet was very relieved that she was busy that night and could not go. The party went well, but at one moment in the evening, Mrs. Elton turned to Jane and said,
"Now, Jane, what are you going to do? It is April now, and you still haven't found a job as a governess yet. I think that I will have to help you. I will write to my friend Mrs. Bragg, and perhaps you can go and work for her,"
she said.
Thank you, Mrs. Elton,
said Jane quietly.
but I'm not looking for a job yet. Colonel and Mrs. Campbell are coming home soon, and I want to spend some time with them first.
Don't be silly, Jane. It is more important that you find yourself a job. I'm sure that the Campbells will agree with me about that,
replied Mrs. Elton.
But, Mrs. Elton,
began Jane.
Now, don't worry, Jane. I will arrange everything,
said Mrs. Elton loudly, and she turned away. Poor Jane! She looked very unhappy, and Emma could understand why. It was clearly terrible for her to have Mrs. Elton so busy organising her life all the time. Luckily, Mr. Weston arrived just then, and the conversation went on to other, happier things.
Hello, my dear friends,
said Mr. Weston, walking into the room with a cheerful smile.
I have just come back from London with news from Frank,
he said.
His mother is better, so he can come and visit us again. Isn't that wonderful?
Mrs. Weston looked at her husband, and they both turned to Emma and smiled.
Yes. Yes, it is,
said Emma thoughtfully. That evening at home, Emma realised something. She wasn't thinking about Frank very much now. She did not even miss him.
Oh dear, I thought that I loved Frank, but now I realise that I don't,
she thought to herself.
I like him, of course, but I'm not in love with him. What will I do if he loves me?
Emma's worries were unnecessary. When Frank came back to Highbury again, they talked and laughed together for hours. But it was very clear that Frank was really not in love with her.
Oh, good,
said Emma to herself, feeling relieved.
I'm sure that Frank and I both feel the same. We aren't in love, but we can still be friends.
Chapter 6. A Handsome Couple. Now that Frank was back, they could finally have the ball at the Crown Inn. When the day arrived, Emma and Harriet travelled there together. This was Harriet's first ball, and she was very excited. When it was time to dance, Frank came up to Emma.
Emma, remember that you promised me the first 2 dances?
He said playfully.
Of course,
replied Emma, smiling at him. While they were dancing, Mr. and Mrs. Weston watched them. Emma danced beautifully and looked so happy.
Oh, yes, I'm sure that they are in love,
thought Mrs. Weston. While she was dancing, Emma looked around the room and saw Mr. Knightley talking to some of the older men. He looked up and smiled at her.
I know that Mr. Knightley doesn't like dancing,
thought Emma.
But I'm sure that he would be good at it, and he looks so handsome this evening.
Everyone was having fun, and the evening went quickly. When it was time for the last 2 dances, Emma, of course, was dancing with Frank, but Harriet did not have a partner.
Oh dear,
thought Emma, feeling worried.
Ah, but I see Mr. Elton is there. I'm sure that he will ask Harriet to dance.
Mr. Elton was standing next to Harriet, but he did not ask her to dance. He ignored her. Poor Harriet was very embarrassed, and she blushed. Emma wanted to help, but she couldn't leave Frank alone in the middle of the dance floor. Just then, she saw Mr. Knightley walk across the room and ask Harriet to dance.
Only Mr. Knightley could be so kind,
thought Emma.
And only Mr. Elton could be so rude.
Harriet looked very happy, and while Emma watched them dancing, she noticed that Mr. Knightley was a surprisingly good dancer. At the end of the dance, she decided to go to him and speak to him privately.
You were very kind to help Harriet like that, Mr. Knightley,
she said.
Mr. Elton is a very rude and unkind person.
Yes, I'm sure that you'll agree that your plans for Mr. Elton to marry Harriet were wrong,
said Mr. Knightley kindly.
I think that Harriet had a lucky escape.
And he smiled. Emma smiled too.
Yes, I was wrong. I can see that now.
Just then, Mr. Weston came up to them.
Come on, Emma. It's time for the last dance.
Who are you going to dance with?
Asked Mr. Knightley. Emma turned and smiled at him.
You, if you will ask me,
she replied.
Now I know that you can dance.
Emma was happy that she and Mr. Knightley were friends again. The next day, while she was thinking about the ball, Frank and Harriet arrived at Hartfield.
I found Harriet alone on the road to Highbury,
said Frank, looking worried.
Some gypsy children were chasing her and she was very frightened.
Oh, Emma, it was terrible,
said Harriet, crying.
But then Frank rescued me and chased the gypsies away,
she said, looking at Frank with her beautiful blue eyes.
What an adventure,
thought Emma.
And what a handsome couple they are. I didn't think of it before, but perhaps...
A fortnight later, Harriet told Emma a secret.
Emma, I don't think of Mr. Elton now. There is another man I think of, but I know that he could never love me,
she said unhappily.
She is speaking about Frank, of course,
thought Emma excitedly.
Oh, Harriet,
she said aloud.
I'm sure that I know who you mean, and I thought that the way he rescued you was wonderful. Perhaps he is the man for you.
Oh,
said Harriet.
Do you really think so?
Yes, I do. But we mustn't do anything until we are sure that he feels the same as you,
said Emma.
This is our secret, and we won't talk about it again. We will wait and watch.
One afternoon, some of Emma's friends were at Hartfield. While they were playing cards, Mr. Knightley was watching Frank, and he noticed something. He saw that Frank was secretly smiling at Jane, and Jane was looking sweetly at him.
I thought that Frank was in love with Emma,
thought Mr. Knightley.
Surely he isn't in love with Jane too.
Oh, don't be so silly, Mr. Knightley,
replied Emma confidently when he told her.
I know who Frank is in love with,
she thought to herself.
And it isn't Jane.
So Mr. Knightley decided to watch Frank closely. The weather was fine now, so one day Mr. Knightley invited everyone to his house, Donwell Abbey, to pick the strawberries there. Donwell Abbey was a very fine house, and after walking around the beautiful gardens, Emma went to pick strawberries with the others. She saw Mr. Knightley and Harriet picking strawberries together, and she heard Mrs. Elton talking to Jane on the other side of the strawberry bed. She was telling her about a job. Later, when Emma went inside, she found Jane there, looking tired.
I'm going to walk home, Emma. I have a terrible headache, but please don't tell anyone until I have gone.
Emma agreed not to say anything, and Jane left. A short while later, Frank arrived late, hot, tired and cross.
I've just seen Jane outside. Why is she going home so early?
He said angrily.
She has a headache,
replied Emma.
Now don't be cross, Frank. Think about our picnic at Box Hill tomorrow. It will be great fun.
Chapter 7. Emma Blushes. next day was sunny and a fine day for a picnic. But it was a long way to Box Hill, and when they finally arrived, everyone was hot and uncomfortable. Frank, Emma, and Harriet sat down together, but Frank was very quiet. Emma was a vain girl, and she did not like Frank to ignore her. So, forgetting about Harriet for a while, she began to flirt with him.
Come on, Frank,
she said, smiling playfully.
Think of something funny that we can do. I'm bored.
Frank laughed.
Come on, everyone,
he said.
Emma is bored. Let's think of 2 clever things to say. A poem or a story, perhaps, and 3 silly things to say. Emma promises to laugh at them all.
And Frank smiled sweetly at her. Miss Bates turned to him.
Well, I know that I can't think of 2 clever things to say, but I can always think of 3 silly things.
She said, laughing.
Ah, Miss Bates,
replied Emma quickly.
The difficult thing for you will be to say only 3 silly things.
Oh, yes, of course,
said Miss Bates, looking embarrassed.
I'm always very silly. You're right. I'm sorry, very sorry. I'll be quiet.
And she blushed and turned away. Nobody thought of poor Miss Bates any more. They were already busy listening to Mr. Weston, who was playing the game. After a few minutes, Mrs. Elton got up.
I don't really like this game, Emma. So Mr. Elton and I are going for a walk.
A short while later, Jane and Miss Bates got up too, and Mr. Knightley followed them. Emma was not enjoying herself now, and she was bored with flirting with Frank. She felt happy when it was finally time to go home. While she was waiting for her carriage, Mr. Knightley came up to her.
Emma, I have to talk to you. And I must speak the truth, because we are friends,
he said. He looked very angry, and then he went on in a cold, hard voice.
How could you be so rude to Miss Bates?
He asked her.
Miss Bates is a sweet, kind person. You have everything in the world, and she has nothing. It was very wrong of you to talk to her like that in front of everyone. Why can't you be kinder to people who aren't as lucky as you are?
Emma knew that Mr. Knightley was right, and she felt very ashamed. With every word that he spoke, she felt worse, and in the end, she turned her face away from him to hide her tears. She did not want Mr. Knightley to see her cry. At last her carriage arrived, and without another word, without looking back, she climbed into it. Mr. Knightley could not see her face, and he just thought that she was cross with him. That evening, while Emma sat with her father, she thought about the picnic. She remembered her unkind words to Miss Bates, and every word of Mr. Knightley's. She was so ashamed of herself that she decided to visit Miss Bates the next day.
Please come in, Emma,
said Miss Bates kindly.
Have you come to see Jane? I'm afraid she has a bad headache and is in bed. I'm so sorry, but she can't see anyone today.
Oh, I am sorry Jane is feeling ill,
replied Emma truthfully.
I hope nothing is the matter.
Well, yes, there is something. You see, Jane is going to leave us. She is going to work as a governess for Mrs. Smallridge,
said Miss Bates unhappily.
Mrs. Elton has arranged everything,
she went on.
At first, Jane said no. She wanted to talk to Colonel and Mrs. Campbell first, but Mrs. Elton would not listen. Finally, poor Jane said yes, but now she has a bad headache and feels ill.
Emma knew that Jane did not want to be a governess, and that she did not want Mrs. Elton's help. She understood exactly why Jane felt so ill.
Oh dear. When does she have to leave?
asked Emma.
In a fortnight,
replied Miss Bates.
It's too soon, my dear Emma. My mother and I are very unhappy about it. But, oh dear, so much is happening. And now Frank has left too,
she said.
He had a letter from his father yesterday. His mother is ill again, and he left early this morning. And then there's the piano. What shall we do with it? Jane can't take it with her, so it will stay here for now, but... oh dear.
While Miss Bates talked, Emma listened and thought of Jane. She wanted to help her, to be her friend, but now perhaps it was too late.
Yes, a lot has happened,
thought Emma while she walked home. When she arrived at Hartfield, to her surprise, she saw Mr. Knightley and Harriet sitting with her father.
Emma, I have come to say goodbye,
said Mr. Knightley, standing up.
I am going to stay with John and Isabella in London for a few weeks. I don't know when I'll be back.
He was quiet, and he looked very unhappy. Emma was surprised, and she did not know how to answer him.
And how were Mrs. and Miss Bates, Emma?
asked her father kindly.
Emma has been to visit them this morning, Mr. Knightley.
Emma blushed, and Mr. Knightley looked closely at her. He said nothing, but just for a second, she thought that he looked pleased.
I'm sorry, Emma. I must go,
he said.
I'm already late.
And before she could reply, he quickly left the room.
I hope that he has forgiven me,
thought Emma, and she nearly felt happy for the first time that day. In the next few days, Emma tried to help Jane. She invited her to Hartfield, and she offered to take her out in the carriage. But each time, Jane said no and stayed at home.
I think that Jane is making excuses. She doesn't want to see me, but I can't blame her. I have not been a good friend to her,
thought Emma unhappily. During this time, Emma heard some surprising news. It began with the unhappy death of Frank's mother. Then, shortly after, Mrs. Weston had something more to tell her.
Emma, my dear, I have some very bad news,
said Mrs. Weston.
I don't know how to tell you this, but Frank and Jane Fairfax are engaged. They have been secretly engaged since Weymouth. It had to be a secret because Mrs. Churchill didn't want Frank to marry a girl from a poor family.
Emma was very surprised, but she remembered Mr. Knightley's words.
So, he was right,
she thought to herself. Then she noticed that Mrs. Weston was looking at her strangely, and suddenly she understood.
Mrs. Weston,
cried Emma.
I know what you are thinking. You think that I am in love with Frank, don't you?
Well, yes. We thought... Well, we wanted to believe...
began Mrs. Weston, but she did not really know what to say.
Perhaps at first I thought I was,
said Emma.
But we both soon realised that we weren't in love. We were just having fun. But, oh dear, what about Jane?
Emma cried.
What did she think when she saw Frank and me together, flirting all the time?
Emma remembered the ball and the picnic, and she blushed.
Oh, Emma, I am so relieved that you aren't in love with Frank,
said Mrs. Weston.
I have been so worried about it. But you are right, of course. I don't know what Jane thought.
I can't forgive Frank for this,
said Emma angrily.
Emma, I know that it's hard, but try not to be cross,
said Mrs. Weston.
Let's wait for him to explain. Mr. Churchill has said yes to the wedding, so we must think of that now.
Oh, no. And what about poor Harriet?
Thought Emma, while she walked home.
I can't believe that we have made the same mistake again.
Chapter 8. Wonderful News. Just after Emma arrived home, she was surprised to see Harriet walk through the door.
Well, Emma, have you heard about Frank and Jane?
Asked Harriet excitedly.
You know?
Said Emma, looking surprised.
Yes, Mr. Weston has just told me. I didn't know that they were engaged. Isn't it exciting?
Replied Harriet, smiling. Emma was confused. Why was Harriet so cheerful?
Harriet, I don't understand. I thought that you would be upset to hear this news. I thought, well, that you and Frank...
What do you mean, Emma?
Asked Harriet.
You don't think that I'm interested in Frank, do you? You know who I like. I know that he is much older and richer than me, but you told me that perhaps he was the man for me.
Harriet,
cried Emma.
You don't mean Mr. Knightley, do you?
Why, yes, of course I do,
replied Harriet.
But when we talked of it, I thought that you meant Frank, because he rescued you from the gypsies,
said Emma.
Of course I didn't mean Frank, Emma. I was talking about Mr. Knightley. Don't you remember how he rescued me at the ball?
Said Harriet, looking surprised.
And since then, he has been so kind and attentive to me. I am sure that he feels the same about me as I feel about him.
Emma remembered seeing them together at Donwell Abbey, and again at Hartfield after her visit to Miss Bates. Why did she not notice that Harriet was in love with him before?
And perhaps Mr. Knightley really loves Harriet,
she thought unhappily. It was all too much for Emma. The idea of Harriet and Mr. Knightley being in love and perhaps marrying. Mr. Knightley was her special friend. She could not think of him with Harriet. Then Emma suddenly realized something.
I never knew it until now, but I believe I am in love with Mr. Knightley,
she thought in surprise.
Oh, this is terrible. What shall I do? I now realize how vain and selfish I have been,
she thought.
All this time I have tried to find Harriet a husband, and I never thought about what she wanted. First, I stopped her from marrying Mr. Martin. Then I wanted her to marry Mr. Elton. And finally, I decided that she loved Frank. I always thought I knew best.
Emma began to feel very ashamed of herself.
I told Harriet that she was too good for Mr. Martin and to look for someone better. If she loves Mr. Knightley now, then I can only blame myself,
she thought unhappily.
And it is clear that Mr. Knightley doesn't love me. He is always cross with me for something.
And she remembered his angry words to her about Mr. Martin and Miss Bates. Emma went to bed, tired and unhappy, but she could not sleep. The next day, when she woke up, she felt lonely and depressed. So she went for a walk in the garden. She was busy thinking about everything when, to her surprise, Mr. Knightley arrived. Emma tried to be calm. They walked together for a little while, but Mr. Knightley was quiet, and Emma was unhappy.
Mr. Knightley,
she said, trying to smile and to sound cheerful.
We have had some news since you have been in London. We will soon have a wedding in Highbury.
Mr. Knightley looked kindly at her unhappy face.
I know, Emma. I have heard,
he said softly.
I can see that you are very unhappy. But believe me, Emma, in time you will forget Frank.
And he took her hand.
Oh, Mr. Knightley,
said Emma, looking surprised.
You think that I am in love with Frank too, don't you? Please believe me. We were both vain and silly, but Frank and I have never been in love. We are just friends,
she explained.
Is this really true?
Asked Mr. Knightley.
I thought...
I know,
said Emma unhappily.
Everyone thought.
Then I have something that I need to say to you,
said Mr. Knightley, looking at her with hope in his eyes.
Emma, we are friends, and I believe that you understand me better than anyone in the world.
He stopped and took her hand again.
My dearest Emma, I love you, and I have always loved you. Will you marry me?
Emma could not believe what she was hearing. Mr. Knightley loved her, not Harriet. He forgave her for being vain and silly. Emma was so happy that she could not speak, but finally she found her voice.
Yes, of course I will marry you, Mr. Knightley. I love you more than anyone.
Oh, Emma, all this time I thought that you were in love with Frank. I have been so jealous of him.
He explained.
After the picnic, I was so convinced of your love for him that I decided to leave Highbury.
Emma blushed, but Mr. Knightley smiled kindly, and she could not feel embarrassed for long. She was too happy. Later, they went inside and had tea with Emma's father, but they decided not to tell him the news that they were engaged yet.
Oh, but how can I tell Harriet?
Thought Emma when she was alone.
I can't see her and not tell her the truth.
So, the next day, Emma wrote a letter to her sister Isabella and asked her to invite Harriet to London for a few days. She knew that Harriet would love a holiday, and she thought that it would give her time to think. She loved her friend and did not want to hurt her. The same day, Mrs. Weston brought Emma a letter from Frank. He was very, very sorry for not telling Emma the truth about himself and Jane. Emma still felt cross with him, but she could not stay cross for long.
I want us to be friends again,
she thought.
But I also want to be friends with Jane.
She decided to visit Jane, but on the day that she went, Mrs. Elton was at the house too, and Emma felt that she couldn't speak freely in front of her. When it was time for Emma to go, Jane took her to the door herself.
Emma, let me explain,
said Jane, talking confidentially.
Please forgive me for being cold and unfriendly to you all this time, but I couldn't be your friend and not tell you the truth about Frank and me. It had to be a secret, so I wasn't friendly to Frank in public either. He didn't like that, so he spent all his time with you, to make me jealous. After that, I was so unhappy about my new job as a governess with Mrs. Smallridge, far away from Highbury and from Frank. I'm sorry, Emma. I really don't like secrets.
But Jane, I am sorry. Please, let's just forget everything and be friends,
said Emma, and they both smiled. Yes. It was time to be friends, but Emma knew that she could not be happy until Harriet knew about Mr. Knightley. One day, shortly after that, while Harriet was still in London, Mr. Knightley told Emma something very surprising.
Emma, I am afraid I have something to tell you which you won't approve of. I have had a letter from Robert Martin.
Emma looked confused and wondered what he meant.
He has been in London for a few days now, and while he was there, he met Harriet again. Well, Emma,
he said, looking worried.
He and Harriet are now engaged.
Oh, Mr. Knightley, this is wonderful news,
cried Emma. Now Mr. Knightley looked confused.
I made a terrible mistake trying to matchmake for Harriet,
explained Emma.
I now know that it was wrong of me. Mr. Martin is a good man, and I believe Harriet has always loved him. I just hope that they can forgive me for always thinking I know best,
she said truthfully. Mr. Knightley looked at her and smiled. How he loved his beautiful Emma. When Frank came to Highbury, he and Jane visited Emma. They were all embarrassed at first, but Frank was soon laughing and talking about their wedding in London. Harriet also blushed when she saw Emma again, and they remembered their conversation about Mr. Knightley.
I was very silly, Emma,
said Harriet.
I know now that I have only ever loved Mr. Martin.
So there were 2 weddings in Highbury that year. First Harriet's and Mr. Martin's, and then, a month later, Emma's and Mr. Knightley's. And after that, Emma decided never to matchmake again.